real personal highlight for me now is to be able to introduce David Price. David is was my congressman before he was gerrymandered away. Longtime colleague here at Duke. Many of you may not know that he's still a member of the faculty in public policy and political science, so he's my colleague and dear friend as well. And everyone here from North Carolina certainly knows, but those of you maybe from out of state may not know David as well. There is really no greater exemplar of what it means to be a public servant serving in the U.S. Congress than David Price. David has been a immensely thoughtful, ethical, tireless worker for a host of issues, but not least the issues we're talking about today, issues around voter rights and the state of our democracy. And so it's a great pleasure to have him here today to talk with us about some of the things that are happening at the congressional level that he's been very involved in. And so it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Congressman David Price.
Thank you, Fritz. Those are very kind words, and I am very, very happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation, the program that you've put together, and the breadth and depth of participation you've encouraged and elicited is truly a sign, I think, that we're onto something here. We've got an issue that has reached a perceived crisis point. I mean, a lot of us thought it was a problem long ago, but there's a level of public awareness and engagement now that really perhaps does give us a chance, certainly in a number of states, but maybe nationally, to do something about it. And so a conference like this is extremely helpful, I think, in laying out the problem, laying out some of the options, and giving us all some momentum going forward. I want to introduce my wife, Lisa, who came over with me, and also Asher Hildebrand, our Chief of Staff, who's been part of this. And we're happy to join you, and I'm happy to announce that I have opened the government back up. Expect full credit, and apparently we do not have to go back to Washington to have a vote on this. I guess I should knock on wood on that one, but that appears to be the case. We have passed in the House maybe a dozen bills to reopen the government every which way. And apparently one of them can be voted over in the Senate, and behold, you have an open government. But we will not get into this unless you want to raise it in the question period. I do want to have time for some exchange, and so therefore I'll be very brief. I want to do two things. One is to present myself as Exhibit A, as a member of Congress, and someone who's in a state and a district that has been ground zero of the redistricting wars, just to give an overview, a sense of how this has looked from one congressional district, one that David Daley actually featured as Exhibit A in his book on the subject. So we'll talk about that briefly, and then say something about how this issue has now become a national issue, and the form that takes, and what we might look at going forward as possible remedies and possible causes for political mobilization. So let me try to do both of those things very quickly. I have been in Congress since the late 80s, so I've been around a while and been through a number of the redistricting wars nationally and in North Carolina. I now have one of the least competitive seats. It's a very solidly Democratic seat, one of the least competitive seats in North Carolina. There are 3 such seats, and I have to tell you that those seats were not drawn for my benefit or for the benefit of my other 2 Democratic colleagues. They were drawn to make the other 10 seats Republican. That's what's going on. And so while I'm personally very, very happy to have a very compatible district, it's part of a map that until now has largely kept me out of the House majority. It hasn't always been that way for me personally, though. The 4th District, when I first ran, consisted of 5 whole counties across the middle of North Carolina: Randolph, Chatham, Orange, Wake, and Franklin. Those counties now would comprise at least 3 congressional districts, maybe more by virtue of population growth. It was a competitive district. The incumbent whom I defeated had defeated a long-time Democratic incumbent. It was a contested race, targeted by the national Democratic and Republican parties for years. The district was redrawn after the 1990 census by a democratically controlled legislature. It was still a competitive district. It was now reduced to 3 counties, Chatham, Orange, and Wake. But it was still a very competitive district, as I confirmed by losing the district in the '94 election. The district was back and forth, and in the Gingrich sweep, so-called, of 1994, this was one of the districts that turned over. Now, that post-1990 redistricting also, of course, was the one that created a number of majority black districts around the country, so that for the first time, a lot of states would have a realistic chance of electing African American representatives to the Congress. And 2 such districts were created in this state. The 1st district, represented initially by Eva Clayton, and the 12th, represented by Mel Watt. That aspect of the redistricting did not affect the 4th at first. The 4th District was largely independent of that. It affected lots of other districts, though. And it made the 1st District, for example, represented by my friend, the 3rd, represented by my friend Martin Lancaster. The 6th District, Greensboro. The 5th District, Winston-Salem. It made those districts more difficult for Democrats to hold. And then came a series of court decisions in the mid-'90s, which required the redrawing of the 12th District, of Mel Watt's district. And at that point, the legislature redrew the 4th District, my district, and made, for the first time, Durham part of the district, removed Raleigh, for the most part, from the district, and it became I guess there was a net gain of Democrats to some degree, but it was still a competitive district, and that's the district I live with largely through the next redistricting, the post-2000 redistricting. That district was left pretty much the way it was. It was Democratic leaning, but it was still diverse. I mean, it was during that period that I had, I kind of went from Carrboro to Fuquay-Varina. And I used to tell people, I have this fantasy. These town meetings, of course, had gotten very contentious, and I have this fantasy about how I'd like to run a town meeting. I will put the Carrboro friends on this side of the room, and I'll put Fuquay-Varina on this side, and then I'll just leave and let them have at it. That's a very tempting prospect. That's not the way it worked, but and I had some competitive races in that district, but it was Democratic leaning, and it was not as competitive as it had been when I first represented it. And then came 2010. Then came the Tea Party election of 2010, and as we said to ourselves, about the worst year to have a bad year one could have imagined. And at that point, the planning that the Republicans had been doing for a long time, and David Daley documents this very well in his book, the kind of planning that they'd been for a long time turned out to have more possibilities than they had ever dreamed, because of the fact that they won so many of these state legislatures, got complete control of the redistricting process in a number of states, like Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio. The exceptions were Maryland and Illinois, but it was mainly a Republican wave, and they were put totally in charge of redistricting, and they proved more willing than Democrats had to take full advantage of their control. As I say, that's very well documented in David's book. So The fourth district in its post 2010 incarnation was really extraordinary. It stretched over 7 counties from Burlington to Fayetteville. Looked something like a map of Vietnam. It was featured in David Daley's book, as I said, and one of the charming features was that it triple bunked 3 Democratic members. My home was still in the district, but so was Brad Miller's, who was representing the 13th district, and so was Bob Etheridge's, who had only recently been defeated as the 2nd district representative. That was a nice little twist, in addition to the strange map, the double bunking or triple bunking of Democratic incumbents. So when there is this comment often in the press that both sides gerrymander, they do it to each other. Yes, that's true, but it is only partially correct. What we've seen in recent years is a kind of hyper-partisan gerrymandering that is at a different level than what we saw earlier. I remember those earlier district drawing exercises, and by the way, Democratic members of Congress learned in very powerful ways often that just because the legislature is Democratic, that doesn't mean you're going to get your way with redistricting. The legislature has a way of doing its own thing with redistricting. Actually, some Republicans learned that in more recent years. But I remember discussions about how there needed to be some balance in this, there needed to be some restraint. And the tweaking of the map actually accommodated both sides. If you look at the map drawn after the 2000 census, for example, you'll find this strange little peninsula that goes into a peninsula for the 13th district that goes pretty deeply into Cary, North Carolina, deep into 4th district territory. Well, why was that done? Turns out it was done to accommodate a General Assembly member, a Republican, who wanted to run, who preferred to run in the 13th district for Congress rather than the 4th. Turns out he ended up running in neither, but that explains the peninsula. It was a tweak that was, in that case, a bipartisan gesture. I think there's very little of that in the current partisan redistricting. It's become hyper-partisan, and it's become far more extreme. And it's, of course, become, in some cases, more subject to court challenges. In fact, my Vietnam district lasted only 2 cycles. The map was thrown out as a racial gerrymander. And now I'm back to 3 counties in the 4th district. They're still packed with Democrats, and we still have a 10-3 map overall in North Carolina. It could be 9-4, by the way, depending on how a contested race comes out in the 9th district. But the barricades are very high. And even in this wave election we've just had, they largely held. We didn't win the 13th district, or the 2nd district, or the 8th district, although I think with a more normal set of lines, those are districts that we would have expected to do better in, and so the barricades held, and the barricades held in Wisconsin, and the barricades held in Ohio. Despite the blue wave, despite 40 new seats in the House of Representatives, none of them came from those hyper-gerrymandered states. So it's reached a point where this has it's become a sore point in American politics with lots of voters, certainly with lots of people on the short end of these redistricting schemes. By the way, that Vietnam district for the 4th district, in that same map, this very county, Durham County, was in 4 congressional districts. 4. Fayetteville and Cumberland County were in 3 congressional districts. People had no idea what district they were in. And it was highly confusing, highly, of course, people felt manipulated, and they should have felt manipulated. So it's become egregious, and it's become more of an issue. I myself have become more and more convinced that gerrymandering needs to be a national issue. That, you might say, is because my ox now has been gored. Well, I don't think that's the only reason. I think it's mainly, in fact, that this practice. The practice of gerrymandering has become so extreme. It's gone to such lengths. The effects on our politics have become so severe that I really believe we need to address it in a far more intentional way. There is, first of all, the disenfranchisement, the confusion of voters and groups of voters in these convoluted situations where they hardly know where their who their representative is, and they find themselves ensconced in a permanent kind of hopeless electoral status. There's the electoral distortion that the gerrymandering creates overall. Everybody, I suppose it's been cited here many times. We won the 2012 popular vote for the U.S. House of Representatives, 59.6 million to 58.2 million. But how many seats did we get for that popular majority? 201 seats, still 34 short. And about half of that would be due to the gerrymandering in the states that I mentioned. There's some other demographic factors that play into this, but gerrymandering certainly helps create that kind of distorted outcome where votes don't translate into seats and don't translate into majority control. And then there's the question of what happens within the districts. There's a kind of fostering, I would say, of ideological extremism, a kind of what does a safe district do to a member? Means the thing you mainly worry about is a primary opponent from the base of the party. That is obviously going to affect one's political calculations and political behavior. So many consequences for our politics from hyper gerrymandering. Finally, how do we fix it? Two things being discussed in great length in this conference, and there are two paths we might go down, or whether we might go down. One, a game-changing judicial decision. Secondly, game-changing national legislation that would require independent, nonpartisan redistricting state by state. The states are acting one by one. 7 have commissions, nonpartisan commissions that have primary responsibility for districting. 6 have advisory commissions. 2 have backup commissions if the legislature deadlocks. And then Iowa has its own peculiar system, actually works pretty well though, of essentially blindfolded legislative staff doing the districts. Unique. It hadn't been replicated, but they've had this for a long time. So about a third of the states have now acted on their own to mitigate partisan redistricting. There have been proposals in the Congress for some time. John Tanner, my colleague from Tennessee, was author of one of the first ones, and I picked up on his legislation. Last Congress, I put together a comprehensive reform proposal called the We the People Act, and put a slightly tweaked version of John's proposal in the package. It calls for nonpartisan independent redistricting commissions for congressional maps state by state. Also provides federal grants to help states defray the costs of these commissions. This year we've introduced as our first piece of legislation, H.R. 1, that's called For the People Act, and it also includes It also includes a redistricting title, a slightly updated version of the Tanner proposal authored by Zoe Lofgren. Also takes this independent commission approach to redistricting. It requires more public comment. It has more specifications as to the public input that must go on. Also has some additional provisions to ensure courts can intervene if the states fail to comply. Zoe Lofgren, turns out, is now in a position to process H.R. 1, or at least a portion of H.R. 1, as we prepare it for floor consideration. And she's working as we speak to conform, to do what needs to be done by way of conforming this to accommodate most state practices that we think are admissible, that actually do the job. We're not looking to prescribe every bit of what every state does, but there's some standards that need to be met, and we think a federal requirement and some federal standards would have a very, very good effect on what's already developing in a great many states. So H.R. 1 must still pass the House. It will pass the House, I can predict. It also can predict it won't pass the Senate. But it's now on the table. And it, by the way, it touches on voting rights, it touches on voter suppression, it touches on campaign finance, on a whole array of related issues. It has the advantage, I think, or the feature of stressing the interrelated nature of these reform proposals, and also dealing with this backlog of reform that our democracy actually is in dire need of. So we know that this will face, at least for now, an uphill climb, but it's important to move this bill forward. It's important to get this on the agenda, and I think the prospects are better than they've ever been for this to become a front burner issue. I've had the experience a long time in town meetings. Whenever you talk about these things, including gerrymandering, all the heads in the room nod. That doesn't mean it becomes a top-tier voting issue for many people. In fact, it hasn't been, frankly. It has not been. And one reason I think the Republican leadership in so many states has gotten away with what they have is that the kind of restraint we used to feel, the kind of concern, this really shouldn't go too far. There's none of that. There's been none of that, and the electoral punishment for that has been pretty negligible. So we have some work to do to make this a voting issue and to frame it in a way that really translates into legislative action. Just a word about the other path to reform, which would be, of course, for the Supreme Court to approve the North Carolina case that's pending right now before them that deals with extreme partisan gerrymandering. It would put that in the same situation as racial gerrymandering, which we're pretty much limited to now. If you can't establish racial gerrymandering, then it's hard to turn these things around in the courts. But we have an uphill fight there too. But we're told we have a strong case. By the way, it's paired with a Democratic case of gerrymandering, Maryland. Maybe somebody's looking for political balance. One hopes so. But in any case, the judicial path and the legislative path both now are real challenges. But it's way ahead of where we have been, and I think this issue is on its way. Increased awareness. There are a lot of good groups, some sponsoring this conference, that have helped raise awareness. The League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Democracy NC, many others have made this an issue resonate with the public, because it is, at the end of the day, it is about our democracy. It is about how a representative democracy can claim to legitimately mirror the wishes, the values, the needs of the people. And if there is a huge distortion between the votes people cast and the balance that they strike then in the representative assembly, then democracy is distorted, democracy is denied. That's the root of it, and gerrymandering is an issue, I think, worthy of our attention, worthy of our best efforts. That's why I take such encouragement at this conference. And I'll be happy to respond to any questions in any time we have remaining. I know I'm standing between you and the reception, but thank you very much.
Why don't we take a couple of questions? We won't go too long because I know there is food, but we do have a great opportunity with David here. So let's take a couple of questions. If we have people with mics, there's a call right here.
Thank you, Congressman. My name is Jerry Ollata from Wake Forest. This is my second question of the session. One, I'd appreciate you giving us some insight into the thinking of your colleagues in Congress. I have a lot of trouble as an adult senior citizen understanding how so many people in both the House and the Senate, of both parties, oftentimes, but right now mostly Republican, can be so cold and callous towards the citizens of the United States with this closing down of government and just generally with their lack of taking responsibility for being the third branch, co-equal third branch of government. Is it that they don't understand the Constitution? Maybe they've never read it. Is it political neglect? Is it just plain political partisanship? Maybe you could give us some insight into how these guys think, these men and women think. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's a tall order, and I'm not sure I can offer much beyond what any of us can observe and infer from what we see. I think part of the challenge is actually related to what I'm talking about here. So let me focus on that, because the way the political system is structured and the perceived necessities of getting elected and reelected do have an impact on office holders, and it affects their selective perception of what they need to attend to and what pressures they have to respond to. And I think it often distorts those perceptions. This shutdown, and there's no way to talk about this without sounding partisan. This shutdown, of course, should never have happened. The shutdown has the disapproval of well over half of the American electorate. And yet, I think it's only when air traffic gets dangerous and some of the prospects of a dire occurrence begin to occur. It's only then that the president has really had to deal with this, and a lot of the Republican leadership. I mean, I think, has mainly cared about his base. As long as he's making 30% of the American people happy with this, it's fine with him. And I think that's true of a lot of these congressional members who are in very safe districts and who are mainly worried about their right wing, worried about the Trump base. That's their main worry, not what we might do to them in a general election. And so the kind of normal reactions you might expect from the prison guards who are living paycheck to paycheck, or the TSA people, or for that matter, the people who are being served. And a lot of that is blunted or diverted. A lot of that normal sympathy. And you'd like to think your political incentives align somehow with your values and your sympathies, right? I mean, that's the way you'd hope a democracy works. But there's something really distorted about the way this has gone, and how hard it's been to break it. I hope the lessons have been learned so we won't get into it again. But I guess the answer I would distill to your question from the situation is that there are real consequences for how polarized and how ideological our politics has gotten, and how distorted representation has gotten by virtue of the way the districts are drawn, and that has the potential to blunt the kind of human responses that you're looking for. I hope not totally, but it's sure had a distorting effect.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Hello, I'm Hunter Nordberg. I'm a student at Virginia Wesleyan University, but I'm from Apex, North Carolina. And you were talking about how you were putting a bill through Congress for independent commissions. But with the divided Congress, what kind of compromise or bipartisan support would you need to get that bill through Congress to the executive branch to sign?
I think we're mainly dealing here with a Democratic initiative. That's not to say this issue has been totally partisan, though, in its history. I assume that's been discussed in the course of the day here. Over in Raleigh, in the General Assembly, there's a history of bipartisan support for nonpartisan redistricting, and there's some history nationally. A lot of that has fallen by the way as our politics has gotten more polarized. if you just think about political reform generally, think about presidential public financing, the major post-Watergate reform. Think about McCain-Feingold, Shays-Meehan, the great reform efforts of the past. Those names are Democratic and Republican. Those initiatives are bipartisan. When I put forward something like even enhanced disclosure for super PAC ads, not exactly an earth-shaking reform. It would be nice to get that done. But it is really hard to get Republican co-sponsors for even a measure like that nowadays. I think we need to probe that. I think we need to have aspirational reform measures, and we need to have some closer to the ground. There was a candidate in this state who, in this last election, a Republican candidate, who publicly said that he disavowed one of the super PAC ads that were supposedly run in his behalf. In other words, he resented to the point he needed to refute it. He resented losing control of his own message to an unaccountable outside group. Well, when enough Republicans feel that way, maybe we get some bipartisan support for flashing the names of the top contributors on the screen, making the super PAC sponsors stand by their ad like we do the candidates and party sponsors. Maybe we do. Maybe some of these things, once again, get some bipartisan traction. But right now, I just have to say that like reform generally, like a lot of issues, the polarization has, it's helped us on the Democratic side to make this a front burner issue. But by the same token, I guess, it's taken away some of the Republican support or made it harder to come by.
Why don't we take two more? So I see here and here. So
Hi, Sam Wong, visiting from Princeton University. I used to be your constituent. One way to move H.R. 1 realistically in the next few years would be, say, for instance, for Democrats to retake the Senate and allow a majority requirement for passing legislation. For moving reforms like H.R. 1 and other things, would it be worth the weakening of that check to have a simple majority rule for passing legislation on the Senate side?
Well, now you're asking a tough question, and I imagine anybody of my anywhere near my age in the room would have trouble with it, because we remember what the filibuster did in the days of civil rights and aid to education, and what a barrier it was. And I expect we've also complained in modern times, particularly when Democrats were in charge in the Senate, we've complained about how it's almost routine now. I mean, I've argued that, well, if they're going to have a 60-vote requirement, let's at least require them to set up cots and have a real filibuster, rather than just routinely requiring 60 votes. That 60-vote requirement looks a little different right now, given the composition of the Senate and given some of the things that we need to prevent, and also the kind of things we would hope to cooperate on. So I'd like to think some kind of supermajority requirement for major legislation is not just purely an opportunistic thing, depending on who's in charge. That we could come to some more reasonable, more discriminating rule that doesn't just make the Senate like the House, but at the same time doesn't just routinely raise these barriers to the majority working its will. Of course, you've seen how that works with judicial appointments, and you know, it's a be careful what you wish for kind of question. When we did this with Harry Reid's leadership, it was absolutely essential to get Obama's judicial appointments through. They were being totally bottled up otherwise. But now we have this flood of Trump appointments that are really going to affect our judiciary for generations to come. So there's not a simple answer to the question you ask, I think, for reformers. I do think it should be a more discriminating tool. I think it should require more actual skin in the game for the for the senators exercising the filibuster. Shouldn't just be routine. But I would not at this point want to see it totally done away with for the simple reason that it has protected us and probably will continue to protect us in times where it's really the only lever of power that progressive forces have.
David, last question.
Hi, David Thornburg from Pennsylvania. Tom Ross made a point early in the day, which I thought was an interesting one, is that political uncertainty might be the best friend of reform, like the type we're talking about here. And whether there's now new uncertainty among the Republican ranks in Congress that hitching their wagon to the president is maybe not such a good idea after all. Political uncertainty maybe stemming from court decisions, maybe political uncertainty coming from a wave of successful efforts around the country to change the way we do redistricting. Those are some sources of uncertainty. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on that question of uncertainty. Does it feel like there's a growing unease among folks, political folks who took things for granted and now maybe they're thinking differently about that? And is that sufficient to get us closer to where we want to be?
Well, I think I don't know exactly what Tom was talking about, but I would guess he was. I would guess he's thinking specifically about this. He can speak for himself wherever he is now. I would guess he's speaking specifically about this redistricting question, where I think the point is a very good one. You know, I think the prospect in the North Carolina General Assembly for actually getting something like this done, which, as I said, has strong Democratic support now and some residual Republican support. The chance of getting this done sometime before the post-2020 redistricting would, and we'd have about 2 years to find this out, it would depend on calculations of the sort you're talking about. If Republicans think there's some good chance that they might be in the minority or even have one house in the minority, and chances are actually increasingly good that that is where they'll be, then that probably increases our chances a good deal. I think it has worked that way at the state level. The states, I haven't checked this out exactly, but I wager that the states that have adopted the nonpartisan commissions are precisely the more competitive states, where there is that degree of uncertainty about which side of the, whether you're going to be winning or losing with the state legislature taking this and running with it. And if you think there's a good chance you're going to be on the losing side of that, then you're going to look more kindly at a nonpartisan solution.
Well, I am afraid we have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Congressman Price.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.